Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second event in the 2023 NACOLE webinar series. NACOLE is an organization that strives to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. One piece of that effort is our webinar series, where for the last 8 years, we have brought you information on the practice of civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few logistics regarding today's session. With so many in attendance, everyone is entered in listen-only mode. But once today's presentation begins, you can access the area to type in your questions by clicking the Q&A icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You will also have the ability to vote on questions already posed to move them up in the queue. This will help us to address the audience's most pressing questions in the short time that we have together. I also want to remind you that today's session is being recorded and will be available to you through the Attendee Hub, the same platform you used to access today's live session. Your same login information will allow you to watch or re-watch the session shortly after we conclude today. With the details out of the way, I'd like to move to our attention to the valuable content of today's session. Before I turn things over to Dr. Yael Granot, I'd like to welcome Charlotte Seeler, the Director of Training at the City of Chicago's Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, as it's known by many. Charlotte has been a part of the civilian oversight community for some time and is a valued member of the NACOLE Training, Education, and Standards Committee, the committee responsible for helping us to develop the content you will see throughout this year's webinar series. With that, I'd like to turn things over to you, Charlotte, to introduce today's speaker. Charlotte?
Thank you, Cami. I'm really excited to be here today to introduce this webinar with Dr. Yael Granot, who does our procedural justice training for our COPA Academy. She is such a wealth of information, such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really excited about this session, which is on bias and interpretation of video evidence. Without further ado, Yael.
Okay, thank you so much, Charlotte. Let me share my screen with you all. All right. Thank you all for logging in to this presentation, to NACOLE for having me, Charlotte for her lovely introduction. I'm thrilled to be able to share with you today some research from social psychology, which is my field, about what I think psychology can teach us and what psychology is still learning about how we process video evidence. In the hopes that learning about some of the specific propensities for bias that we might have when we interpret video evidence, that might be helpful to you all in the work that you do when navigating evidence that might come in video forms. And I'm going to try to speak for about 40 minutes and leave as much time for questions as possible. So I am going to present to you a roadmap for the talk in a second, but I want to first focus on why I think video evidence might be unique. And that's all down to the way that visual information is itself unique. So we know that visual information is more quickly and deeply interpreted. It's better remembered, and it's even prioritized relative to information that's coming from our other senses. People seem to trust their vision, and they proclaim that trust explicitly. My graduate advisor, Emily Balchetis, conducted a survey of about 1,400 people from 16 different countries, and she asked respondents which of their 5 senses they would least want to lose. And regardless of age or gender, over 70% of folks said that vision was the sense that they would least be able to do without. And we basically lift vision up on a pedestal, despite the fact that visual attention, visual information, visual processing is limited. So, for example, our central focus of attention, which is where our perception and encoding are sharpest and clearest, we sometimes call that our foveal view, is only 1% of our visual field. So if you all really want to do this at home, you can actually stick your hand up and it's roughly twice the width of your thumbnail on your outstretched arm. That's the space where our vision is clearest and sharpest. I think if you're all going about your day, you think you've got a handle on things a lot better than that. You're like, okay, this is blurry, but this is pretty good. But it's actually this very small area that's very sharp and very clear, and there's degrees of perceptual degradation after that point. And so because our visual resources are limited, our environment is also very visually complex, we have to then use our attention or deploy our visual resources in ways that are selective. So we have to prioritize some information at the expense of other information. And we know that attention has to be selective, and it might even be selectively tuned to certain things. So we know attention is selectively tuned to low-level things like luminance and contrast. That really draws our attention. But also higher-level things, our expectations, our goals, our motivations can also direct our attention. So what that means is, among other things, when we're presented with the same visual information, we might not all attend to it the same way, and we might end up seeing very different things. I also want to suggest that, as you can imagine, has big implications for the legal system. So in fact, vision and visual attention is considered more credible. Visual evidence is considered more credible than other forms of evidence. And in fact, vision and visual attention are considered so important by the legal process, the legal system, that blind jurors are actually the only class of persons that can be barred from jury service without it being considered discrimination. Recent cases have found, for example, that when deaf jurors are prevented from jury service, they can sue for discrimination and win because they cannot be barred from service because of that disability. With blind jurors, the court makes an exception and says that it's up to basically the judge to decide on a case-by-case basis, because there might be some situations, especially in the case of video, where evidence is so valuable and needs to be considered fully in a way that blind jurors might not be able to do. I will note, by the way, that there is anecdotal evidence that actually says the presence of blind jurors might improve the legal process for everyone, insofar as the presence of a blind juror forces attorneys to highlight only specifically the evidentiarily relevant pieces of information that can be garnered from video, rather than going beyond the information given. But given how much emphasis is then placed on the importance of visual and video evidence, it's important, I think, for us to better understand our own propensities for bias when we evaluate it. So let me highlight for you what I think the problem is in a nutshell, or how I'm trying to organize the talk for you today. And so what I've tried to do is organize a handful of, I think, systemic biases in the way that we watch and interpret video evidence that come from both factors inside the perceiver and factors that are endemic to the evidence itself. So the evidence might highlight certain things or be missing other pieces of information. And in particular, in this overview of examples, I'm going to highlight three main issues that I think are helpful to consider in how biases in the way that we attend to visual information, video evidence in particular, might affect our judgments. So two of these are that, generally speaking, people struggle with how to distinguish between relevant and irrelevant information. And so they overweight what they see, but they also underweight what they miss. Also, people are overconfident in their interpretations. They aren't aware that they have a potential for bias when evaluating video evidence. They have this seemingly direct firsthand experience, right? I'm seeing this with my own eyes. Therefore, that makes them feel especially confident in the information that they're getting, and makes it particularly difficult for them to question their own interpretations. So what I'd like to do with you today is try to share some notable examples of these three processes of overweighting, underweighting, overconfidence from the research that's been done so far on these issues. I also want to note that I am in no way arguing against the importance of video evidence. I think we all can agree that it's often providing us valuable information we might not otherwise have. And it's because of that value that we want to better understand our own vulnerabilities in watching and interpreting it. So I'm going to start with this idea of overweighting. So we overweight the information that we see. What that means is essentially, what we see is going to have an outsized impact over our decisions, even if it's only part of a broader picture. So with overweighting, we find that video evidence makes the information that it captures particularly salient, and then perceivers tend to ascribe greater agency or causal force to the targets that they see. And this can be, I think, best seen in work on what's called the camera perspective bias. So this is work often done in the context of police civilian interrogation videos, where they find that essentially if you're looking at just this, right, a suspect-focused view, where all you see in this videotaped interrogation is this guy who seems nervous and twitchy and sweaty, potentially, you tend to ascribe greater guilt and greater likelihood of sincerity to his resulting confession than if, for example, you saw a broader perspective that included the police officer, right? Now we have some context. We have, oh, maybe he's sweaty and twitchy and nervous because he has this officer that's looming over him. And in that context, in that broader perspective, people actually are less likely to think that his confession is sincere and that he is guilty. So this is essentially suggesting that the angle of the camera directs our attention. And there is actually work that takes this and uses eye tracking and finds that it's that over and above just showing this information, this actually makes us put our eyeballs on him more than we otherwise would. And it's that highlighted attention that leads us to describe more agency and more culpability to him. Another, I think, way that the process of overweighting can be powerfully seen is that we might actually ascribe veracity and agency to what we see, even when we're seeing something we know didn't occur. So, for example, in one set of studies, participants completed a computerized task where they had to essentially bet fake money on their likelihood of getting a series of multiple choice questions right. You can see how old this study is by the image of the old computer, et cetera. But when they get a question right, the screen shows a green check. When they get a question wrong, the screen shows a red X. And essentially, they're instructed to take monopoly money from the bank when they get a question wrong, but not when they get a question right. And that there are going to be consequences if they do take money when they're not supposed to, essentially. What researchers also did is they put a camera in the room with participants, telling them sort of, don't worry about it, basically. And then the researchers organized a second session where they had participants come back and they essentially accused participants right away. They said, hey, we know that you took money when you shouldn't have. And half of participants were told, we have footage of you doing this. And half of participants were told, we're actually shown doctored video footage of them taking money when they shouldn't. Basically, they spliced together a scene where they were taking money and overwrote the check with a red X. So it made it look like they were taking money at a time they weren't supposed to. So basically, half of participants are getting accused and just told there's video, half are getting accused and actually watch the video of them doing something they fundamentally know they did not do. And essentially what happens is all participants are then asked, like, we want you to sign a confession, right? This is the closest psychologists can get to creating real legal context within an ethical way, basically. I know it's definitely, the stakes are not as high. And that's why all participants signed the confession. They were basically just like, get me out of here. I don't care about this researcher. I just want to leave. But there was a huge effect of the doctored, actually watching the doctored footage led those participants in that condition to also start confabulating reasons why they might have done it. They come to believe and internalize that they actually did. They say like, oh, I guess my hand must have slipped, or maybe I didn't see what was on the screen. And so it's actually seeing that video footage is so powerful that they come to believe something they know didn't happen. And I will say, this is actually shown in a couple other studies as well, where they can even show you photographs, and they can put like a caveat at the bottom of the photograph that says this image may have been doctored, and it still meaningfully affects the way that people make decisions. People can't unsee it, and so it still impacts their judgments. So that's another example of overweighting, even in the face of what we know to be not true. It still bears a great impact on our decision making. So we overweight what we see. But we also conversely might underweight the information that we miss. And we might miss information for a number of reasons. You might miss things because the camera angle isn't quite capturing it, or you might miss things because you directed your attention away and you're actually looking over there and not over here. But we might also miss information that we're directly looking at, that's right in the center of our visual field. And this is often called inattentional blindness. And researchers who study inattentional blindness, I think maybe you guys are familiar with this. It's most famously known about as sort of the invisible gorilla studies. You maybe have come across these videos before. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. I'm going to show you an example video. If you have, I still think I'm going to get you. So hold on and bear with me, and we'll watch this video anyway. So here is an example of one of the invisible gorilla videos.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
All right, so hopefully if you had already seen this video, there was some, the color changing curtain offered you a new thing that you may have missed. But essentially it's demonstrating this point that sometimes we might be looking directly at something and not consciously see or perceive it, which is an example of how you and I might look at the same spot and come away with a different interpretation or understanding of what happened. I also just want to sort of make an anecdotal diversion here and just say, as a fun aside, that this is, I think, a nice example of the way that researchers and legal practitioners can communicate and connect, because this particular line of research or these sets of studies were in large part informed by a real legal case, actually. And this is a case where in the mid-90s, about 1994, Boston police were searching, essentially 4 young Black men had fled a car and run away on foot. The entire Boston Police Department was out that night running after them. And Officer Kenneth Conley was on foot pursuing one particular suspect. He happened to pass a number of his fellow officers on the path who were actually beating a young Black man who they thought was one of the suspects, but was actually an undercover police officer. And in the resulting case against those officers for this unlawful force, Conley was asked to testify. And he was asked to say what he saw, and he said, "I didn't see anything." And the court said, "How is that possible? You were right there. It was right in your line of sight. We don't believe you," basically. And he was actually accused of perjury and sentenced for perjury. And this led the researchers to try to understand, is it possible that people could actually miss something this profound that's happening right in the center of their line of sight, basically? And in fact, in addition to the original gorilla, the invisible gorilla studies, these researchers actually tried to sort of create a replica study where they had participants come to the university track and field area and run after a research assistant, but then they staged a fight off of the path, basically, and tried to see if they could recreate the same pattern. And they found that absolutely some people still missed the fight, and that was especially true at night. And so this is just a sort of a caveat moment for especially talking to audiences like this, investigators like yourselves or people who are working in these arenas. The way that we end up doing better research that helps and informs, hopefully, the work that you do is in collaboration with you and thinking about the real situations you're dealing with that you would like to understand better. So I'm going to make a point at the end to have my contact information there. And if there's any things that you are thinking is missing from the research that you'd like to see more of, please don't hesitate to reach out. So this is an example of underweighting. Again, we might miss something, and things that we miss, we don't then factor into our decision-making process. Another example of underweighting, I think, is really interesting and has to do with new work on body cameras in particular. What I'm going to do is actually show you 2 video stimuli from a real recent study from folks at Northwestern, looking at body camera footage and comparing it directly to the same scene, but taken from the dashboard camera of that officer's car. So I'm going to show you the one perspective and then the other perspective really quickly. So here's the dash cam perspective of the officer trying to approach this car. All right, now here is the same scene, instead taken from that officer's body camera. So hopefully you're reflecting on how you may have seen these videos differently. What the researchers found, and they showed police civilian videos, but they also showed other kinds of actors. And what they found systematically is that body cameras lead to a decrease in the perceived culpability, intentionality, and guilt or punishment worthiness of the police officers involved. Basically, the body camera wearer is seen as less agentic because he is not seen. Basically, if we're missing something, we can't ascribe any agency to it. And functionally, the only time we see the officer in that video is in the reflection of him in the screen. So what they find is the more that you don't see the officer, the more that people blame the officer less, for example. And they actually wanted to try to figure out if this is because of either identification, like maybe if we look through body camera footage, we are taking on, by looking through the police officer's eyes, fundamentally, we identify with him more, and that's why we punish the police officer less or blame the police officer less. And they tested that against this idea of just visual saliency. And they found basically broader support for the idea of visual saliency, because what they did is they took like tons and tons of body camera footage and coded the degree of visibility of the officer. So again, we saw, a little bit of his arm in the frame. We saw some of his reflection. And so they coded like level of visibility across a number of videos and found that the more that the officer was visible, the less we see this leniency effect. And so I just think it's sort of an interesting thing to note is that this technology that's intended to provide accountability of officers' behavior is in fact actually systematically leading to the underweighting of officers' role in these scenarios because we can't see them to ascribe any agency to their actions. So that's an idea of underweighting. Another sort of last point I want to make about underweighting is that it might be facilitated by the fact that we don't realize we underweight missing information because we often fill in the blanks, both perceptually and cognitively, in such a way that we might not actually even feel like we are missing any information at all. So for example, here's another set of studies or an image from another set of studies. And in this research, participants saw incomplete images like this one here of a half of a butterfly, this half completed butterfly. And then they were given a subsequent memory task, and they were asked to recall what they actually saw. And so they were given a direct chance to choose between this example, the half filled butterfly, but also this full completed butterfly as well. So they were like, okay, multiple choice, which one was the one you saw, basically? And participants systematically misremembered having seen the whole butterfly image. Basically, they completed the image that they had previously only seen part of. And this extends to actually research on real world scenes. It's a phenomenon called boundary completion, where people actually in their memory might extend visual images beyond what they actually saw. So for example, if you only saw an alleyway up to the trash cans, you might actually remember seeing further than the trash cans based on past experiences of alleyways that you have seen. You might sort of fill in the blanks and feel like you got more of a complete picture than you actually did. And so in that way, this perceptual filter that fills in the blanks might prevent us from realizing that we are missing critical information. Lastly, we are overconfident about our interpretations of what we see. So we talked in the beginning about how people prioritize and have a lot of trust in vision. But this can be especially notable in a context when visual information is pitted directly against your other senses. That are offering contradictory information. So this is actually an image from a classic study where they actually gave people an object to hold in their hands, kind of like a rock-shaped object. And they wanted them to indicate what the size of the object was, but they had to look at it through a lens, kind of like a funhouse mirror lens that distorted the size of the image. So basically what's happening is your hand is giving you accurate information. Your eyes are, as you know, giving you incorrect information. And people still went with their eyes more than their tactile senses. They trusted their eyes more even when they were getting directly contradictory information and they were getting the correct information from their other senses. I also want to note that maybe sort of all of this seems sort of kind of like a duh thing for you. You might hear all of this research and think, sure, yeah, we know we have these fallibilities. But the point is that we do know that, but we don't allow it to filter the way that we think about our own visual experience. So we have a blind spot basically to our own propensity for bias in perceiving visual evidence. My colleague Kristen Jones and her colleagues did a study where they actually asked people to imagine that they were watching or witnessing live or watching a video captured police-civilian interaction. And they were asked to what extent they agree with the idea, if I'm paying very close attention to the event, I can prevent my worldview from affecting my understanding of the video. And people believed that that was much more true for themselves than it was for the average American. So basically the idea is like, sure, people might have biases in visual perception, but I don't. And so that, I think, speaks to this idea of overconfidence. Part of what I think also might explain overconfidence may be the fact that people systematically avoid new or conflicting information, even when it's offered. So you might be sitting there thinking like, okay, I know that people are biased when they watch video maybe one time, but the legal system gives people a chance, or we as investigators have a chance to watch a video multiple times. And if you watch it multiple times, that should reduce bias, shouldn't it? I'm getting all the angles, more information. I'm giving myself a chance to get a more comprehensive picture. And so my colleagues and I thought so too, and we actually tested that directly. We had people watch video evidence. This is particularly a scene here. You can see an example of this. This red dot is one participant's focus of attention using eye tracking as they are watching a video of a police-civilian altercation. So we literally use sort of the computer technology to measure where they put their eyes, where they put their central focus of attention as they watch the video. We had them then answer questions about the scene and make legal judgments. Then we had them watch the video again and make legal judgments again. So we eye tracked them twice, basically. And what we found across two watchings was a very similar pattern of visual attention. Basically, people demonstrated the same visual path that they had already tread. They didn't take the opportunity to get new information. They took instead the opportunity to confirm their existing account of events. And so that's what we're calling visual confirmation bias, which, as you can imagine, is analogous to what we know of as regular confirmation bias, where we seek out information that confirms our expectations and avoid information that doesn't. It seems like in video evidence, people do the same thing. They can actually make, like, when given the chance to look for new stuff, they don't look for new stuff and they follow the same path they had originally tread. I'm going to take the last few moments actually to try to speak to something that I think maybe you are sitting there wondering, which is, so, okay, what can we do? Right? One question is, does learning about this help? So is me telling you about this now inoculating you against these biases? And I will say that the research is still out. Well, we don't really know how much learning about these biases is enough. In many instances, information about these kinds of biases is not powerful enough to undercut them. So even when you go forth today and watch video, you might still succumb to these same issues. But I'm going to show you something that we tried to do in the lab. So I'm going to highlight my own ongoing research for a second, just to show you something we're trying to do to see if we can teach people to watch in ways that makes them less vulnerable to some of these biases. So we're trying to use attention as a tool rather than sort of fall prey to attentional biases. So how can we use attention as a tool to, in fact, mitigate bias? And so what we did is we actually tried to understand this idea, particularly we were thinking about video evidence research that we had done before, where we were looking at dynamic altercations between a police officer and a civilian, between a white actor and a black actor. We had done a number of research in the past, research studies in the past, where we had seen similar stuff to what I've outlined before, which is the idea that people look, where people look affects the kinds of agency they ascribe, the decisions about culpability that they make. So you can imagine if you're watching two guys in a fight or two guys in an altercation, if you're looking only or predominantly at one actor, you're functionally missing half the scene. And so maybe that's potentially that narrowing of attention is problematic because it again, overemphasizes some things, underemphasizes other things. So how can we instead encourage people not to do that? And we took as our guidepost research on holistic processing, holistic attention, which uses a lot of sort of old school shapes like this. And what they have found is if you actually use eye tracking and measure how people watch this visual illusion, the more that people look to the black Pac-Man shapes equally. So the more that you distribute your attention equally between the three black Pac-Men, the more likely you are to pick up on the implied upside down white triangle that's part of that visual illusion. And we tried to think about, like, how does that affect how people evaluate real scenes? Can we take that same idea of equal attention and encourage a more holistic understanding of video evidence and a scene involving an altercation between two actors? So what we did is we actually we recruited white participants, white American participants, and we measured their sense of identification with their white in-group, as well as how much they identified with their white in-group relative to Black Americans, how much you identify with white Americans over and above your sense of affinity with Black Americans. We then manipulated their attention to a videotaped scene that we filmed, which I'm going to show you in a second. We said it was a fight that broke out at a local community center between this guy, John, and this guy, Keith. And in the control condition, we called it the natural attention condition. We said, as you watch this video, you could look at John, you could look at Keith, you could look at the background, just do whatever comes naturally. In our manipulation, our intervention condition, we're calling it our relational intervention condition to hopefully get people to pay attention to the relationship between actors in the scene. We said, you could look at John, you could look at Keith, you could look at the background. Please do your best to focus equally on all aspects of the scene. And then we showed them this fight scene. This is a little bit of a snippet of a 45-second scene. I had two research assistants basically do a summer-long fight club where we filmed a bunch of stimuli so that we could use it for future research. But we also made sure that they were equally culpable, basically. We made it equated for violence, et cetera, and each actor had distinct but equally violent actions in this fight. And so then what we did is we told participants, okay, you are now the legal decision-making body. There's two separate cases that the community center is bringing against this guy, Keith, and this guy, John. They're mutually exclusive. You're going to make decisions about both cases, but separately. And we asked them to assign months of jail and months probation to John and to Keith. And so what you're going to see in this graph here is months in jail, months probation, and it's a different score. So this 0 point here represents equal punishment of the Black actor and the white actor. Higher numbers represent more punishment of the Black actor. Lower numbers represent more punishment of the white actor. And what you can see is in the control condition, when they were allowed to watch however they wanted, we see a classic pattern of bias, racial bias, outgroup bias, where the more that you're affiliated with being white, the more that you punish the Black actor relative to the white actor. This is a pattern that we see in the legal system, generally speaking. But when we told them, please look equally at all aspects of the scene, we find that pattern goes away. Essentially, you have this flat line where people are punishing both actors equally, and now their identity, which isn't relevant to their decision-making process, is no longer directly impacting their decision-making process. And so we wanted to see, okay, we told them to do this attention thing. We tried to train their attention. Did it matter? Did it actually shift the way they put their eyeballs on the video? And so we did the same study again one more time, but this time in the lab in front of an eye tracking computer. So again, we're bringing white participants in. We're having them indicate their sense of in-group identity, how much they are affiliated with white Americans over and above Black Americans. We again manipulated how much, whether they watched it naturally or whether they were asked to focus equally on all aspects of the scene. But this time, in addition to punishment, we also measured how long they are looking to both actors. We also asked them to self-report on that. And I think this is a really interesting piece that I wanted to make sure to share with you, because I think it reflects how hard these biases are to get rid of. So basically what we did was we said, okay, you just watched this video. What % of the time do you think you focused on John? What % of the time do you think you focused on Keith? So again, this is a different score where 0 represents equal attention to both. So in our intervention condition where we said, please equally attend to both, you can see no difference from 0, right? People are like, yeah, you told me to look equally. I looked equally, 50-50, the whole time. But I think what's critical is when left to their own devices, the pattern is the same, right? Think about any scene that you have watched. You come away from that being like, no, yeah, I got a good representation of that. I saw everything equally. I got this covered. And I think that's what this control condition is reflecting. People don't realize that they might be watching in skewed ways. And so you might want to know how they're actually watching. And that's where I think this last interesting bit of data I wanted to share with you speaks to that. So this is their real patterns of visual attention based on eye tracking. And again, the 0 point is equal attention to both actors. Higher numbers are more attention to the Black actor, and lower numbers are more attention to the white actor. In the control condition, we found a really weird and interesting pattern where identity predicted attention. So the more that you were affiliated with being white, the more you looked at the white actor. The less you had that affiliation, the more you looked at the Black actor. But essentially, attention varied all over the map. However, when we asked people, please look equally at all aspects of the scene, they absolutely did. So it's this interesting catch-22 where people can't actually consciously reflect accurately on what they're doing, meaning when they're told to look equally, but even when they're told not to look equally, they still think they did it right. They still think they did 50-50 attention. But somehow the training, this idea of equal attention still works, right? It's getting that instruction still somehow unconsciously affects the way that people actually do deploy their attention. And so all this is to say, I'm hoping that this gives us a kernel of a potential strategy we could use to try to encourage people to take in information more broadly, more comprehensively. So just to summarize the kinds of things that we just talked about today and to leave a little bit of time to chat with you guys at the end, hopefully you're coming away from this idea that we don't all see evidence the same way and seeing why that might be. People aren't aware, I think that's critical, that they attend selectively to information, that they might miss some things at the expense of other things. People seem to overemphasize what they see and fail to consider what they might miss, often very confidently failing to consider what they might miss. And then this last piece seems to speak to the fact that we can potentially teach people to watch evidence a little bit more comprehensively. And certainly we can teach people, like we're learning together today, about their visual processing experiences. And whether that actually can eliminate some of these biases, I think remains to be seen. So just sort of as a final note, given the proliferation, as you guys are well aware, of video evidence, I think it behooves us to try to understand the ways that we might be biased and how we're interpreting it without even realizing it. And hopefully you might be able to apply some of these considerations when you encounter situations where people are coming away with very different interpretations of the same video evidence. And so with that, I want to thank you all again. I want to thank my collaborators. I also want to particularly thank Sandra Rostovska, who's a communications professor at UC Boulder and has participated in part of this talk and put part of this talk together with me. But she has also been working with the American Bar Association's SciTech group to connect scholars and legal practitioners around issues of video evidence. And with that, I sort of want to emphasize putting my contact information out there for you, because again, I think the research is always better informed by the real situations that practitioners are facing. And so if you guys have things that you're thinking of or situations that are coming up for you that you're like, oh, I wish we had data on this, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'd happily work together with you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Granot. And we do have some questions in the queue. So I want to start with, have any studies been done on overweighting things in video if the viewer is, for example, an officer or lawyer versus a member of the public watching a video?
Oh, that's a great question. As far as I know, no. And in large part, that's because we have a really hard time accessing the officer and lawyer population. The easiest population for us as researchers to access is, unfortunately, the undergraduate psychology student population, but also there's an online database of people that take surveys for money online, which is a somewhat broader representation of the American public. So it takes us years of networking to get in the door with lawyers and with legal professionals and officers. So if folks have connections or want to see that study done, I would absolutely want to see that done as well.
Great, thank you for that. Our next question is actually really a statement. This is incredibly important information that should be a part of all training for investigators, auditors, and review boards that make findings on officer misconduct. Yes. I think I would agree with that. The next question is, how will artificial intelligence change the findings of research and bias?
Oh, really interesting. So I don't know why my first thought came to deep fakes. I'm not 100%. I mean, I'm still learning. We're all still learning about what artificial intelligence can do. But I think that the best sort of answer I can give is this idea of more and more videos are being sophisticated doctored footage is being created. And I think not only are we vulnerable to, I think what is fascinating about what the research tells us is not only are we vulnerable to it because it's visually compelling, we're vulnerable to it even if we know it is doctored. And I think that is what's sort of mind-blowing, is this idea that you can tell people this is fake and they still are like, sure, but like, I saw that though. And it's hard to unsee. And so I think that's part of what's going to be really pernicious is, you know, those very sophisticated videos of Keanu Reeves dancing, you know that he didn't, but it's still stuck in your head as an image and a potential truth.
Thank you for that. So we just had a flood of questions in here. So let's see if we can get to as many of them as possible. In training, we generally call inattentional blindness tunnel vision and try and teach officers breathing exercises and incorporate commands to have officers scan 360 degrees around them to break the tunnel vision and be more aware of things.
Wow. I did not know about that. Thank you for sharing that. I'm definitely going to look that up. It sounds like, especially because we're trying to look at effective strategies for how we can erode some of these biases that are so hardwired. This idea of sort of slowing things down and encouraging that broad attention is really compelling. Thank you so much.
And hopefully the person who asked that would be willing to talk to you more about it. That sounds like they are involved in training in that technique. So the next question is, does the same culpability results happen when you do the study with Black participants?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So I will say this particular research I haven't done with Black participants because we were trying to find classic patterns of outgroup bias and sort of more closely approximate what we see happening in the legal system at the jury decision-making phase. I have shown that same video to Black participants as well, and also had really rich and interesting debriefings with them. It's sort of in the context of a different study. So I showed, and basically I had reduced culpability ratings, but I had a lot of folks coming up to me and saying, I punished the Black actor less, not because I thought he was less culpable, but because I knew the consequences for him would be more severe in long-term legal processes. And so the sort of rich qualitative thinking that my participants were doing as they were watching these videos that I didn't really have a way to capture is something that sort of really sticks with me to try to understand how it is that people are watching these videos and the implications of what their decision-making might be about these videos. So I don't have like a direct comparison, but I do know that that's what people are saying they are experiencing when they're watching these videos or thinking about when Black participants are watching these videos.
Incredibly interesting. From the example of different levels of blameworthiness when viewed on body-worn video versus dash cam, could you speak more about whether the discrepancy is caused more by identifying with the body-worn video wearer versus the possibility, oops, sorry, my cue moved up on me, versus the possibility that the body, sorry, everything keeps moving because there's so many things coming in, versus the possibility that body-worn video may see other context?
So I think that's a great question. And again, this is colleagues that that did this research, not myself, but this is Broderick Turner and his colleagues at Northwestern did a series of these studies, including this police civilian video. And what they tried to do is really test this idea of like, are you motivated? It's about motivation and identity. Like, are you seeing through his eyes? And that's what's really going on. And they seem to find that it is not as much that as it is just the cognitive low-level invisibility of the officer. Because he is not there, you cannot punish him for anything or blame him for anything because there's nothing to tag blame to. And I think that's what's really compelling is that they did this sort of index of degree of visibility across multiple body camera videos and showed that the more you see the officer's arm swing into frame or his reflection in the car window, the less you see that leniency, because finally people have something to tag blame to. So when he's invisible, he's not part of the context anymore that you can attribute culpability to.
So moving on from that, what are the potential impacts of policies allowing officers to view video evidence before making their testimony while suspects must make their statements before viewing the video?
That's a really good question. And there is research on that I didn't get to cite here today. And you all, I think, probably know more about this firsthand than I do. But there are a couple studies out there that show, obviously, that allowing officers to watch video does overwrite, affect, and sort of then shape subsequent testimony in line with what they saw in the video. And so that can obviously create a huge systemic disparity if you're letting, some people watch and some people not. And watching does, your narrative after is post hoc reconstructed by what you watched in the video. So it's a huge problem to consider. And I think you all know better than I do how that could be regulated in some more systematic way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So moving on, how does watching video in slow motion affect one's perception?
Great question. Okay, so this is another team at Northwestern, actually related to Broderick Turner. It's Eugene Caruso and Zach Burns at Northwestern did this amazing series of studies, I think like 10 years back now, about slow motion. What essentially they did, and this was actually at the time when the NFL had just passed rules about, and I'm going to betray my lack of football expertise here, rules about trying to reduce concussions by a certain kind of tackle. There's like a certain kind of tackle in football that's more likely to produce a concussion, and they wanted to reduce that. And so they basically ascribed a fine to players who engaged in that kind of tackle. And so Zach and his colleagues essentially showed people the same tackles in slow motion or fast regular motion, regular speed or slow motion, and found that people were much more likely to ascribe intentionality and culpability when in slow motion than when in regular speed. And then he did the same thing with police-civilian encounters and found the same thing. What slow motion seems to do is kind of inflate the time it seems that the actor could have done something else, right? You could have made a different decision. You had so much time to make a different decision. Why didn't you do that? And that's what happens when you slow the speed down. Part of why I sort of, I'm making this call for folks to get in touch about what is useful to you is it wasn't until lawyers came to me related to the slow motion question and talked about frame rate. So I didn't know, for example, that some old surveillance cameras only take one frame every 4 seconds. And so in a case like you can imagine an attorney might splice those frames into a faster representation of events than it actually is, or a slower representation. And so how do you account for the fact that what that does to time and stretches out a scene is important to consider. So all we have is this one study about slow motion and intent, but I think that's a good starting point for understanding that it really does seem to affect how people evaluate the same situation.
Thank you for that. So our next question is, can you elaborate on what we tend to fill in and how other implicit biases affect what we will fill in?
Interesting. So I will say this idea of like filling in and boundary extension is older research. It's from the 60s and 70s and hasn't really, so much of what I shared with you today, not a lot of it has been done on video yet. That's why I think it's so important as psychologists for us to work together with you all, because we're still working on, drawings of butterflies, right? But we need to bring drawings of butterflies into the modern age. That being said, the legal system also sort of, according to the federal rules of evidence, still treats photographs and videos almost interchangeably. But we know that dynamic footage is different. And so I don't actually have any research I can cite for you on boundary extension or filling in video, because no one has yet looked at that in this more dynamic process. But you can imagine, I think you're sort of highlighting a point or nodding to a point about implicit biases and the idea that people fill in with the information they have available to them, which is often their stereotypes and shorthand. Those are shortcuts for them to try to get information when they don't otherwise have information available. And so you can imagine how implicit bias might lead to one way of filling in. This is, for example, related to research like old school vision researchers. A guy named Moshe Bar at MIT did stuff on how, like, imagine you see an object, for example, a guy holding a cell phone. You see the outline of the shape first, and then your brain tries to go quickly to try to fill in or resolve what that shape is as quickly as possible by eliminating alternatives. And part of what happens is sort of biases or shortcuts might help us fill in the blank and fill in the object as being a gun when it is not a gun, because of things like stereotyping, trying to fill in the blanks quickly for us when we're trying to resolve an image.
Very interesting. Let's see, our next question is, are there any places for investigators to get more training so that they can testify to the limitations or biases involved with video evidence? We need people to have this knowledge so they can add context to the evidence others are watching.
That's a really good question. I think we're so early days on this that I don't even know of psych researchers who have testified before courts on this yet. So I think because the research is, so sometimes I get lawyers talking to me. And I have never sort of testified about this stuff. In large part, I'm sort of nervous that what we have is essentially what you've seen today, which is the need for more research, right? We've had like one study showing this and one study showing that. And it wasn't until the eyewitness memory researchers did 30 years of replication studies before the legal system allowed them in to come share their findings. And so we're still sort of at the very early days of that. So I don't know that there are a lot of resources out there to sort of translate or bridge the gap between scientists and practitioners as much as I would like to see, which is sort of why I jumped at the chance to come talk to an audience like this, because there's not that many opportunities for us to do it.
Thank you for that. So the next question is someone who is wondering about things that we can't see. For example, if someone has a mental illness or disability that isn't visible, then how do we measure what really happened in any given video?
Oh, wow. That is a very interesting question and goes to a level of depth I don't even know. I've definitely not tried to explore yet. But I think the idea is context matters a lot, and context frames video. So I will say, I've talked to you a lot about how people watch evidence and watch information, and I want to just step back and say context and framing matter a lot. I used to often give talks like this, where I started with the example of the Rodney King case, because the Rodney King case seemed to be clear-cut evidence of police brutality, and yet it's often suggested that the attorneys for the defense were so good at what they did because they directed attention to the videos very powerfully. They said, here, let me pause here and show you what's happening right now. What that is police responding to this code or whatever, and this is how they're acting in this moment. And then, oh, you see this is what's happening over here. So sort of savvy storytellers directing attention can have an outsized impact on where people look, but also then how they interpret what that is that they're seeing. And not a lot of research has yet been done to disentangle the framing from the actual low-level visual experience. So I'm giving you like, here's what people are experiencing without the extra filter of context and setup. But you can imagine that a narrative that sort of speaks to directing people's attention to mental illness involved or things that they can't see or backstory can be really powerful, right? That's why, for example, in cases when, we have police officers saying that they experienced one thing and this is the context of what they were experiencing, that story, that narrative of what they're saying their experience has an important impact on how jurors and grand jurors then evaluate what it is they're seeing in video evidence.
That's so interesting because it's nearly impossible to disengage the framing with.
Not only that, but in a legal context, I'm always fascinated by the fact that one side always goes first. And if one side always goes first, does that erode any chance the next side has to undermine the first framing?
Mm-hmm. That's the next study, right?
Yeah, totally.
So a few more questions. We'll see how many of these we can get in the time we have left. But have you initiated scenario-based information where you have officers and community members view the same incident? If so, what were the results?
I would love to do that. I will say I just moved to Smith College, which is in Northampton, Massachusetts. And so it's pretty small town insofar as I just served jury duty for the first time. And it was a pothole case and it got dismissed. And the town clerk was like, I don't know if you guys know Miss Flo's Diner. And then he said, oh, Charlie eats there every day. It's that kind of small town experience of the legal system. And so I have not yet tried to recruit police officers here. Again, this is sort of like an access issue in that I'd be interested in how to connect with police departments in a way that makes them find value in what I can offer them while also having them participate in the research in a meaningful way. So right now, I don't have any direct comparisons of police officers and civilians. I will say some researchers have been able to do that. So for example, there's classic research on shooter bias paradigm, this idea where participants are brought into the lab and they see scenes where Black and white targets are holding weapons or non-weapon objects, and they have to decide whether to shoot or not shoot. And they find that civilians are essentially more likely to make errors and go faster than police officers are. And so police officers are less likely to show the bias than potentially civilians are. What that means about how they would see footage of these kinds of scenes that happen after the fact and are no longer in the heat of the moment, I'm not actually sure. And I think is a really good open question.
Absolutely. So why do you think Hold on a second. They're moving around again. Any thoughts on the ability of body-worn camera video to assess officers' ability to assess mental illness impairment?
Oh, interesting. I see what you're saying. Meaning, well, maybe I see what you're saying. I think you're suggesting that it could be used as a training tool, because I can't imagine that wearing the body, there's a lot of interesting evidence about whether wearing the body-worn camera affects officers' engagement with someone. But I think what you're asking is, based on watching the footage, can you sort of maybe build a training for officers about what to look for? And that, I think, is especially interesting, right? Is after the fact, can officers use the same footage and try to look for different cues? And again, I think that would come back to this idea of framing and what are we trying to present this footage to do? And if you're trying to present this footage as a training tool, I bet you could probably use it really meaningfully to highlight cues of how an officer should potentially deal with a situation, especially with someone with mental illness.
Thank you for that. So next, what consideration has been given to the information you have learned in your research? Is it purely human nature and cognition rather than a bias or predisposition for a specific viewpoint?
Okay, I think I sort of, let me step back as to what the meat of that question is. It reads like the question reads like, is this really hardwired or is it, and I think some of this stuff is really low level, right? Like we look more to shiny things than not shiny things, but some of this stuff is really about sort of higher level framing, right? So we've done videos where we take two ambiguously, light-skinned folks or brown-skinned targets, and we manipulate the perception of one of them as Latino and one of them as an Arab immigrant, right? So an American-born versus an immigrant, and we did the same kind of research that I shared with you at the end. And then we switched the labels. So that suggested that it's nothing inherently visual about those two targets when you sort of can't necessarily distinguish what group they're coming from. It's the label that we put on them that then shifts how we're thinking about or perceiving those targets. So the overarching framework of group identity really matters over and above what the sort of low-level visual stimulus has to say. So I think it's both. And I think we just haven't done enough work yet to try to tease apart what you're speaking to.
And then I think for our last question, because we unfortunately have run out of time, on the topic of frame rate, which you mentioned earlier, is there a difference in perception when viewing 24 or 30 frames per second footage versus something in 60 frames per second footage?
Ooh. So I don't know in the sense that no one's tested it yet, but I would imagine the same logic applies from the only study we know is that one study of sort of slow motion and intent. And so I imagine that frame rate works in the same way as it did in that study comparing slow. So faster speed might reduce this sort of culpability bias, basically. That the more that you can eliminate the idea that somebody had another option or something else that they could have done, essentially the faster it goes, the more it seems like they couldn't have helped themselves from doing what they did. And so definitely worth testing that, especially given the huge nuances and different speeds of videos that we're likely to see.
Absolutely. Well, with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions. So I want to take a moment to thank you and extend my sincere appreciation for you joining us today and sharing your work and perspectives with the broader oversight community.
I really appreciate it. And I absolutely encourage anyone who's out there watching this and wants to learn more or follow up, please don't hesitate to email me.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. NACOLE could not do what it does without those like yourself who are so willing to share your knowledge and expertise. I also want to thank Charlotte for her work to introduce Dr. Granot to our community. And also thanks to all of our audience members who took the time to be with us today to ask great questions and really be part of our learning network. So thank you very much, Charlotte, and our audience. Just a little bit of information about our upcoming events. So our next event in the NACOLE webinar series will be taking place on June 7th. We'll be welcoming retired Captain Spencer Fomby, who will be discussing and demonstrating use of force techniques as they're being taught in academies across the country. This will be followed up on July 13th by a webinar looking at the evolution of use of force, a session that'll be put on by NACOLE member Ashley Heiberger, who is also a member of our Training, Education, and Standards Committee. Please watch your inboxes as registration will be opening later this week for those events. I also would be remiss if I did not mention once again that registration for our 29th annual conference is now open. It will take place in Chicago, November 12th through the 16th. We will have sessions geared towards jail and prison oversight, training that will build better oversight in your jurisdictions. We'll also be taking a look at innovation and collaboration in the field and examine the importance of community in oversight. So with that, I want to thank you once again for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, everyone.